Firstly, what I'm going to do tonight, or attempt to do, is talk about four separate levels, if you like, of the book. Firstly, what its aims and methods are. Secondly, say something about its contents. Thirdly, discuss and criticise those contents. And finally, some conclusions and a couple of recommendations. So, to paraphrase Marx, a spectre is again haunting the Americas. And in this case, it is again socialism, albeit in a new garb. In this comprehensive work on the theme, Latin America's turbulent transitions, two processes are the focus of the book. Firstly, the gradual demise of US hegemony in Latin America, and secondly, the advent of a left alternative, generally, if not a little nebulously known as 21st century socialism. But, and again the authors borrow from Marxism, neither process is complete, hence the notion of a transition with turbulence. This review rests on Marx's argument that dialectical thinking is the key to engaging society and changing it. Or to borrow from Terry Eagleton, the Marxist literary critic, the aim is to praise and to criticise in the same breath. Turbulence's first three chapters consider globalisation and its Latin American discontents, the rise of the so-called pink tide of anti-neoliberal countries, and the complexities of the challenges posed by 21st century socialism. These chapters elaborate also the author's theoretical position. They tend, on my reading, to minimise class and draw from a post-Marxist pantheon, if you like, which includes identity politics, Hart and Negri's notions of the multitude and the swarm, and postmodern philosophy of unarmed social movements like the Zapatistas. The next four chapters present case studies of four key countries involved in regional integration in the new century, namely Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil and Ecuador. And Cuba is considered as a final case, given its distinct path in arriving at the present conjuncture. Socialism and the long Latin American spring is the theme of the conclusion, effectively a balance sheet with a carefully drawn, or I think carefully chosen, seasonal metaphor, spring, the season of spring. One presumes deliberately, but in this case also written in lowercase. In essence, this book is about a clash of survivals in the Americas. On the one hand, if US capitalism is to survive and expand, and that's its only option, given both the logic of capitalism and the logic of imperialism, it must renew its influence over Latin America. Without hegemony over the region, more so now given the rise of the BRICS economies, US capitalism is probably doomed. On the other hand, real independence for Latin America rests on precisely the opposite scenario. Political and economic independence require the defeat of US and allied imperialisms, plural, operating in the region, including British, God save you Margaret, Spanish and Australian, as a precondition to the fulfilment of socialist transformations, tentatively and turbulently, as the authors say, underway. So 21st century socialism arises then in the context of and interacts with a particular historic conjuncture. The weakening of the US empire, the eruption of anti-neoliberal social movements, the rise of new left governments, and the growing integration of the region at last on its own terms. As the authors note, by the end of the short 20th century, a borrow from Eric Hobsbawm, the Washington Consensus, that is, the IMF-imposed neoliberal structural reforms as a condition for loans, was under pressure as the new social movements combined with the internal contradictions of late capitalism challenged neoliberal regimes, whether they were under dictatorship or formal democracy, those imaginary democracies, to the point where most presently collapsed. This paved the way for the pink tide of these reforming regimes that we've mentioned, And others, by the way. Paraguay is also among them, Uruguay is among them, Nicaragua is among them, to some extent Argentina is among them. And this all occurring as Cuba was offered reintegration via the Organization of American States as it slid into oblivion. The Caracazo in Venezuela was the spectacular expression of the first of these movements. Although Brazil's Movimiento Sin Terra, the movement of the landless, and Uruguay's revived Frente Amplio were also on the scene at around the same time, perhaps slightly before. On the other hand, the US strategy was to shift support for proxy regimes across the region, like Colombia, particularly under the narco presidente Álvaro Uribe, in Chile, in Mexico, and in Guatemala, about which we're going to hear some more, I think, tomorrow, combined with increased naval presence and burgeoning military bases as counterinsurgency gave way to a supposed war on drugs as the pretext for a new wave of surrogate armed intervention, and ramped up investment in cultural imperialism through media, popular base, and party political projects. So where opportunity arose, established Washington ploys of aiding the military or constitutional coups have also been implemented. So Venezuela 2002, Honduras 2009, and Paraguay in 2012. Soberly briefed by this history, the authors are cautious not to overstate the revolutionary potential of their principal focus countries. It seems to me that is a significant plus in the book. Chapter 2 talks about the pink tide and discusses its origins, and in my view, in my humble view, it's very well written, both from the non-expert and the expert point of view. It's very readable. China's displacement of the United States as chief trading partner to Brazil and Chile has contributed to regional economic independence from US capitalism, combined with the rise of regional trade alliances like UNASUR, the Union of the Nations of South America, and political economic alliances like the Bolivarian Alternative for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA, and its Banco del Sur. But the consummation of the Community of Caribbean and Latin American States, CELAC, in 2011 may be the linchpin of the new alignments. Its combined regional, political and economic platform includes preferential, I'm quoting here, preferential trade tariffs, collaborating in energy and environmental projects, and ending illiteracy in every country in 3 years. During its gestation, the Group of One, which was Venezuela at the beginning of the decade, when, you may remember, Chavez boldly stood up to the imposition of the free trade agreement of the Americas. You may have heard me quote Fidel in other contexts on this. Fidel Castro described the FTAA as a meeting between a shark and some sardines. That by 2005, this Group of One had become so powerful that it was able to crush, to flatten the FTAA, and the book, it seems to me, does that explanation and historicises it very well. In fact, the project became so attractive that even Berlusconi in a poncho, by which many of us now refer to as Sebastián Piñera, President of Chile, had to join up. We learn that Venezuela's entry into Mercosur was ironically achieved thanks to the 2012 Paraguayan coup, whereby Paraguay's suspension from Mercosur removed the only obstacle to Caracas getting a seat at the table. So Caracas was shooed in while in the wake of the coup. Chapter 3 poses the question of whether or not the pink tide is a genuine anti-capitalist challenge. The negative thesis is argued by the neo-extractivist school led by Eduardo Gudinas, who argues that no pink tide government has significantly modified its extractive sector, nor has any moderated the social and environmental impacts of the sector by pursuing alternative development not dependent on primary exports, e.g. Petrol or copper. The cautiously positive thesis is put by leading revolutionary intellectual and Bolivian Vice President Álvaro García Linera, namely that the majority of Bolivians now benefit, in their case, from the exports generated by those industries, which result from diversifying external markets and stimulating the home market. Both positions speak to the central question of the role played by the state in the pink tide governments, which the authors correctly, in my view, link to benign or hostile interplay with the social movements, and which they presently survey as a question of class and production within capitalist state formations. Revamped constitutions, as the authors note, have to compromise and are limited within this framework. This key chapter concludes with the author's synthesis of major... I'm not giving away too much here, This key chapter concludes with the author's synthesis of major theoretical positions on the origins, achievement and directions of the pink tide nations. And I want to just mention one, who is the Cuban Roberto Regalado, who adopts a critical stance pointing to a contrast between Brazil and Uruguay on the one hand, where left parties came to power after decades of struggle and internal reform, and Bolivia and Venezuela on the other, where the party system fell into discredit and social movements were the lead catalyst for change. Their goal, he argues, should be nonetheless identical: socialist transformation. Marta Janica, the Chilean philosopher, her perspective is similar as to ends, but she dwells more on the performance of the subject governments. This approach, it seems to me, carries the risk of overemphasis on the transient character of the political regime as opposed to the permanent features of the capitalist state. This is not an Austin original. This was being argued almost 20 years ago by James Petras and our very own Maurice Morley. And it seems to me this is an important point to bear in mind reading that chapter. In the current conjuncture, the chapter on Venezuela takes on heightened importance. Geopolitically, Venezuela sits between a mature revolution, Cuba, and a mature counter-revolution, Chile. However, as the post-April 2013 election scenario reminds us, sooner or later, all revolutionary processes reach a fork in the road, expressed as a class confrontation. Multitudes and swarms, it's hard to name we talk about, it seems to me, play less of a role in this than do the organised working class and peasantry. That is, if they are to have a chance of winning. They're now arguably structured in novel and promising ways, built on epoch-making social advances in Venezuela, but are nevertheless part of a participatory democratic process expressed by the Chavez-initiated vehicle of a party, the PSUV, Venezuelan Socialist Party, and now led by a new working class, significantly working class president. Just as an aside here, it's no coincidence that the Venezuelan left, which has been enormously solidary with something like 100,000 Chilean exiles that it's hosted since the coup 40 years ago this year in Chile, that this Venezuelan left retains a keen interest in Chilean political history. Whenever I'm there, that's what I'm asked about. Not what's my latest project, but, oh, Austin, we've heard you've worked in Chile. What do the Chileans think about us now? What do they think are the prospects for victory or defeat? It's quite fascinating. That conjuncture is playing out in a continental context much more favourable, however, to Venezuela. And I urge you to think about this. Think of where Allende was 40 years ago and where Venezuela is now. The continental context is dramatically more favourable to the Venezuelan situation than it was to Chile. And also, please remember this, that's no guarantee. The chapter itself, in my view, is very comprehensive, both at the level of theoretical discussion and political economic detail. And that's a feature of the book, by the way. It has encyclopedic detail throughout, which is very well sourced, and it seems to me helps the reader take on his or her own separate investigation if they wish to. But it's very well organised on that level, and I compliment the authors for the encyclopedic detail that they've presented for us. Their interpretation is up for debate. That's what books are about. That's what intellectual and political life is about. However, to move on. Unlike Allende and the dominant popular unity bloc, Chavez and the Popular Assembly have understood the essential nature of taking audacious initiatives at key favourable points in history. Popular unity did not learn this lesson, especially when the balance of forces, as I mentioned, is favourable, like straight after major tactical defeats of the opposition, such as the rollback of the coup in 2001 or the defeat of the petrol strike in 2002, or major electoral victories like 2006 or the new nationalisations in 2008. Once the chapter ends with the re-election of Chavez in 2012, later editions, which I'd encourage, will have to deal with the mounting challenges of the post-Chavez scenario, which it seems to me is in no way guaranteed. We've just had a virtual dead heat in the elections in Venezuela. And I read an article today, and I'm hoping to print it to distribute in the next day or so. An article just sent to me this morning by Manuel Sutherland, in my view, a very fine young Venezuelan political economist who uses the state electoral office's figures to show that while the PSUV vote since 2006 rose in the order of 12%, the opposition vote rose 56%. So let us not delude ourselves about the challenge facing Venezuela, and it's a strength of the book that it doesn't either. Bolivia's communitarian socialism also benefits from a wide-ranging review, pivoting on the symbolism of its largely indigenous population, electing its first indigenous president in 200 years of supposed independence from colonial rule. Wisely, in my view, the chapter on Bolivia also recognises the centrality of Andean oral traditions. I'm a historian. Oral history is a relatively new line of investigation. The book picks it up. And in fact, the authors note that the election of the movement towards socialism, or MAS, and in particular Morales to the presidency in 2006, and I quote, reflected the fact that the party encapsulated and built upon Bolivians' historic memory of struggle, the long memory of indigenous resistance to colonialism, and the short memory of revolutionary nationalism. That, of course, is a reference to the 1952 revolution, all but successful revolution in Bolivia, which sprang from the mine workers. These concepts underpin the communitarian socialism described by Garcia Linera, you remember he's the vice president, as an amalgam of two sources: the working class, science and technology on the one hand, and communitarianism on the other, derived from the historic peasant agrarian structures. And conscious of the time, I'll skip somewhat what I wanted to say about that chapter and comment very briefly that, as I concluded on that particular part, predictably the unfolding social processes run up against the political economy of the late capitalist state, financially and militarily subsidised by imperialism. The book details the major instances of that tension, ranging from the right-wing secessionist movement in resource-rich Santa Cruz to US-backed coup plotting in 2008 and the failed Morales recall referendum in the same year. Mark Becker's chapter on Ecuador, and in particular on what he quotes the Ecuadorian left as calling buen vivir, good living socialism, is a lucid account of another Andean variant on the book's central theme of 21st century socialism. It also highlights the evolving but so far unsettled definition of the content. As Becker notes, President since 2006 Rafael Correa is more prone to say what it is not than what it is. In this, he is at one, as the authors point out, with the Brazilian sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who defines 21st century socialism, and this is a quote from the book, as a metaphor for something to which one aspires, but does not know exactly what it is. Correa has so far proposed 7 revolutions: economic, social, political, ethical, integrationist, environmentalist and judicial. His notion of 21st century socialism seems to draw on the historical pantheon of Marxist and idealist or utopian socialism, including Mariátegui, but he rejects, and this is a quote from the book, class struggle, dialectical materialism, the nationalisation of all property, and refusal to recognise the market. Poignantly, it seems to me, we learn that Correa, quote, had a Catholic education that gave him a strong concern for social justice, but did not provide him with as sophisticated an understanding of Marxism as his counterparts, who were products of the public school system. Now, we public school system snobs, myself included, think that is a rather key point in understanding exactly where he's come from politically. This Catholic left background has led to conflict with left feminists in Ecuador over issues, as the authors point out, like abortion and gay marriage. Moreover, there's been an underlying tension with the mainstream left and key elements of Ecuador's well-organised social movements over issues such as his capitalist agrarian policies and social programs, which favour his electorally supportive urban areas over rural ones. On the other hand, his default, that is to say the Ecuadorian state's default, led by Correa, on a $3 billion debt, for example, in 2008, and expropriation of around 200 companies belonging to a collapsed major bank, one greater claim. So too a series of economic measures which recognise the class character of the central bank. When you hear the Reserve Bank governor speaking, think of the context. We hear that in Australia as if it was some god totally remote from politics, pronouncing from the mount about the objective state of the economy, rather than a capitalist reactionary banker speaking on behalf of the conglomerates that he represents and that rip us off in our daily lives. So, to his great credit, the regime and Correa in particular politicised the central bank, booted the governor out, radicalised its structures, and this has gone into very well by my colleague, Mark Becker. Ecuador's anti-imperialist credentials during Correa's reign have been impressive, and the chapter points this out, but that's perhaps the greatest strength of the regime. It's taken a whole number of measures, and perhaps the one you'll remember best is that when the United States insisted that its new base at, it be able to continue its base, tell me if I've got this right there, when it asked to continue its base at Manta in Ecuador, that it have complete control, unfettered control over that base, Correa responds, absolutely, give us a base in Miami, you can have one in Ecuador.
Yeah, he said it was a Florida case actually, but
okay. So, there are some other details there, but I'll skip over those, because there's a big country to deal with and a big chapter on it, a very interesting, very good chapter on it. Brazil. Brazil's initially democratic socialist manifesto in 1981 had already eliminated reference to socialism and red symbols by the time Lula contested the first election for president that he ran in 1989. He's run in 4, by the way, and like Allende, eerily, he wins the 4th time round. This chapter, chapter 7, deals with the background and unravelling of that key decision in a country whose economy outstrips the combined economy of the rest of Latin America and is now in the top 5 globally. Ever present, we learn of US military officers training torturer assassins during the dictatorship from 1964 to, I think, 1984. The staggered national strike, which catapulted Lula to fame in 1979 and foreshadowed the dictatorship's collapse, and the painful rise of the Workers' Party from 1980 and the Landless People's Movement from 1984. Their relationship, and that's a critical relationship between the party, the Workers' Party and the Landless People's Movement, developed around loosely defined pro-socialist, anti-capitalist and anti-Stalinist affinities, with the Workers' Party limiting itself largely to electoral politics, while, as we know, the movement of those without land, the Landless People's Movement, practiced massive peasant occupations of fallow land, that is to say land which was unused but which was workable. And they've also developed, as an aside, and as Becca briefly mentions, and sources, an extraordinary popular education program. So with Lula's ascent to the presidency, the Workers' Party dominated progressive coalition government struck out on a radical internationalist foreign policy, to some extent at odds with its domestic support for neoliberalism. And it struck me reading this chapter that it was rather like Mexico, rather like the institutional revolutionary party in Mexico, which has an extraordinary revolutionary internationalist policy in comparison with its domestic policy. The Mexicans, I know, compañeros and compañeras, talk about the indigenous Mexicans being such fascinating people, particularly when they're dead. As the government's concerned, that it has always had a very pro-Cuba policy until recently, and a very pro-independence policy for Latin America. So that parallel, it seems to me, is a worthwhile one making. Major contradictions have arisen during this process underway in Brazil, and I think we need to remember what the authors remind us periodically throughout the book, and that is that all of these new processes, all of these entire processes, as a historical continuum goes, are drops in the ocean. The longest has run for a little over 20 years. So these are perhaps 25 years. So these are tiny periods on the historical microscope when taken in conjunction with the 520 years of colonialism and imperialism which Latin America suffered. So very quickly, a final comment on that chapter, that what the authors there, I think, very carefully point out is this great contradiction, where on the one hand we have an internationalist foreign policy which gives great strength to those immediately around it in Latin America, and on the other it allows for the development of transnational agribusiness, which of course is the mortal enemy of the Landless Peoples Movement, and has allowed a whole series of capitalist features in the economy to be not just strengthened but mightily strengthened, and in fact a transfer of resources into the hands of the 1%. These are all ameliorated along the way, by forms of, it seems to me, paternalistic grants to big chunks of society. 25 million people no longer live in absolute poverty. But the effect is a little similar, if you're familiar with Chilean history, to what's occurred with the Concertación governments up until the time of Berlusconi's Componcho, which is that rather than the left strengthen from these things, it weakens. They have a diluting effect on the way the left operates. And I comment here, alleviation and liberation are opposites, just as, and I'm talking in particular about poverty alleviation. Alleviation and liberation are opposites, as are charity and solidarity. And the Lula and now Dilma Rousseff's careful confusion of their meaning will surely, hopefully, not be permanent. Finally, Cuba. The chapter on Cuba takes up with Cuba at the crossroads, but it historicises the issue and points out that island socialism, a term that I saw coined by Tim Anderson, now finds itself, perhaps ironically, moving away from the revolutionary socialist model it embodied, while much of the region was officially hostile, at precisely the most favourable conjuncture in Latin America in the last 40 years. That is to say, for much of the period post-1959, Cuba became increasingly isolated, particularly through the Organisation of American States, with the penetration of organisations, as the authors point out, like USA, and imperialism's conduct, and in particular its apparent winning of the Cold War. So at the very time when the scenario becomes more favourable over the last 20 years, Cuba, it seems, is moving away from its revolutionary socialism and contemplating another form. I won't spoil the chapter for you because the authors debate that, I think, pretty comprehensively. I'd just like to make a couple of observations in that sense that I began talking about what the function of the critic is, that is to say, to praise and to criticise in the one breath. So firstly, I've suggested, and I've suggested at length in the written review, I've suggested earlier in this review that I want to wonder aloud speculated aloud about the value of Eurocentric post-Marxist theories in the context of Third World revolutionary struggles. There's a refined Argentino, compañero mío, and much more important than that, a brilliant Marxist in my view, named Atilio Borrón, compatriota of one of the authors, who notes, for example, in relation to Hart and Negri, that the literature on which they rely is a mixture of North American social science and French philosophy. Marta Haneke, by the way, was seduced by this for some time. You'll probably know that she was in this Chile and later, more broadly, the interpreter in Latin America of the long debunked Althuserian form of Marxism. It was the Bible when I was studying philosophy in the 70s at Sydney University, by the way. We were fed in as if it were invincible Althuserian Marxism, and our textbook was Marta Haneke's The Basic Concepts of Historical Materialism. Now, so it seems to me that's worthy of mention, and one would hope in a future edition to see perhaps some more reference of the great pantheon of Latin American Marxists, in particular Juan Antonio Mella comes to mind, Mariátegui I've mentioned, but there's Celia Hart from Cuba, Silva Federici, who's doing some great things with Marxism and feminism in the Argentine context, and one of my favourites, I have to say, Nestor Cohen, who's recently put out a very interesting Bolivarian Marxist interpretation of Latin American history. You can get it online, or just send me an email, I'll send it to you. There's also a reference in a couple of places to what appears to be, and forgive me if I've misinterpreted this, Fred, what appears to be a presumption that the US Agency for International Development, USA, is a relative novice on the scene. Well, I want to assure you it's not. And in my research, for example, on literacy programs in Chile, which came out ultimately in a 2-volume edition, USAID was active in the 1960s, from not long after its foundation by Kennedy in 1961 as an arm of the Alliance for Progress. Latin American compañeros will remember the Alianza para el Progreso from Punta del Este in Uruguay in 1961, and it's been a very effective operator in cahoots with, and I point this out in the written review, the State Department, the CIA, the United States Information Agency or Service, in lavishing financial support on all manner of state and civil society organisations to secure and normalise support for US interests. Now, just before I make one brief final remark, I thought, given the relatively informal nature about this launch and having already had a drink before we began, I'd be very happy to make a couple of comments about who the authors are. And I begin in the written version by setting up the reference to them through a wonderful book, in my view, called The Battle of the Intellectuals, La Batalla de los Intelectuales, written by the great Basque dramatist Alfonso Sastre, where Alfonso Sastre takes left and pseudo-left intellectuals to task for their backing away from protagonism in left struggles across the continent, but particularly in Latin America. And then I go on to point out that we're not in the presence of such people here. I better be careful not to do a Correa and define things by what they're not. So what are they? Roger Burbach, like myself, has recently defied death and returned to the struggle. This book continues his 3-decade trajectory as an author of major works on contemporary Latin America, beginning with the short but very poignant work Fire in the Americas, which was co-written with Sandinista Revolucionario Orlando Núñez around 25 years ago. Prophetically, its chapter on the internationalization of struggle in the regions begins with these words 25 years ago. The Americas, more than any other part of the world, possess the social raw material for a new revolutionary vision. Secondly, Michael Fox. Well, he's the co-author of a book, you probably know it, Venezuela Speaks, Voices from the Grassroots, He once edited NACLA, Report on the Americas, and he's a freelance journaler and translator, radio reporter and documentary filmmaker now based in Brazil. He's also worked as Fred on Venezuela analysis, and his work's certainly been quite widely published. You'll find no difficulty, if you leave out the middle letter J, you'll find no difficulty finding the real Michael Fox on the web and getting some of his work. Finally, we know Federico as a long-time activist. For his years, it seemed forever an activist on the left in Australia, and we know that he was based in Caracas for several years as a researcher, and he reported from there for Green Left Weekly. And we know that he has already three important books in the Latin American literature, written on the radical projects unfolding in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Paraguay, with no one less than the great philosopher Marta Hardiker. Finally, a couple of words about Mark Becker, because I gathered from reading that he was originally going to be involved in the authorship, but in any event, he's contributed a chapter, and as an academic myself, I feel some affinity with some of his achievements. In particular, the fact that he won a place not very long back on one-time Marxist and now Zionist David Horowitz's list of the 100 most dangerous academics in America. And I point out in the written review, an honour surely sought by any academic to the left of Genghis Khan. Horowitz, an open defender of Senator Joseph McCarthy's politics, has alleged that Ecuador, and I quote, is one of Latin America's most stable democracies. And here's Becker's response. Next to Haiti and Bolivia, Ecuador is in fact the least stable democracy in Latin America. Since independence from Spain in 1822, Ecuador has only 9 constitutionally elected presidents who have successfully completed their terms in office and passed the banner on to a duly elected successor. In the last 10 years, not one chief executive has completed an elected term in office, and there have been at least 3 extra constitutional changes of power. What a sweet way to describe a military coup. That was up to 2006, of course, before the current incumbent. So to conclude, turbulent transitions, in my humble view, is a major contribution to the new social history of contemporary Latin America. It contains, and I use that word again, an encyclopedic amount of poignant detail on each case study, and they're presented in a way amenable, as again I said, to both expert and non-expert. It's also written unashamedly and with admirable sensitivity from the perspective of the vast majority, and in careful solidarity with the post-colonial popular classes and millenarian indigenous civilizations. They in turn are famous for not waiting for intellectuals to have their theories up to date before forging, to quote Burbach, new revolutionary visions. Spiritually and fondly, however, and at one critical level or another, this book is likely to accompany that. Thank you very much.